My question is, supposedly we have a government shutdown, but I'm reading that 84% of the government is operational. When they posted the statistics that 800,000 people were furloughed, that's less than 40% of the overall, number of employees the federal government has. Why, if we're in a shutdown, don't we have the government shut down except for minimal security required services? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So there are a lot of designations that are involved in a shutdown. Designations have to be made with regard to who is essential and who is non-essential within the federal government. I don't understand exactly how it works. The executive branch of the federal government is enormous, and so there are a lot of decision makers at the department level and at the sub-cabinet level who have to make these determinations as to who will be furloughed and who won't be. But you're exactly right in that it's rather unlike a shutdown if 84% of the federal government remains operational. And that's one of the many reasons why this is absurd, that we're seeing that the World War II memorial is being closed down. They actually had to put up barricades in order to keep people out. At Mount Vernon, not only did they, or at Mount Rushmore rather, not only did they shut off the national park portion of it, but they also went to a scenic overlook where people could pull off the side of the road and gaze from a distance at Mount Rushmore. The Park Service employees actually put out orange cones to keep people off of that scenic overlook so they couldn't even look at Mount Rushmore from a distance. This is sick. This is demented. This is really, really twisted. It's one of the many reasons why we shouldn't be entrusting the federal government with more power. We should be entrusting it with less, if anything. We certainly shouldn't be giving them control of our healthcare system because it's 1/6 of our nation's economy, and it also involves a whole lot of decisions that are very personal, very private, and frankly, none of the federal government's business. In the meantime, it is important to focus on the fact that it isn't a complete shutdown we're dealing with. In fact, most of the government is still open. It's still operational. 84% of it is still functioning as usual. There's therefore no reason why this administration ought to be so bent on making life as difficult for people as humanly possible.
Yeah, Senator Lee, I was wondering, I've read lots of different places about your opposition to the health care law, and I'm wondering, I haven't been able to see or find legislation that you've put forward not to cancel it or defund it, but ulterior legislation to help reduce health care costs, to help provide health care to the entire nation. I haven't seen a counter solution. I've just seen a block. Can you address that?
Yeah, sure.
Have the Republicans put forward any kind of legislation that would change the way I pay my health care?
Yes, a number of Republicans have, and I'm one of them. This is a question I get periodically, and there are a lot of people who assume that Republicans haven't put forward anything, and it isn't true. I've got a proposal that I presented in connection with my Saving the American Dream plan, a comprehensive budget overhaul plan, but it also included a health care overhaul plan. It was aimed at several basic objectives. We wanted to increase the affordability of health care and also make health care portability a possibility for the American people. It would leave individuals and families in charge of their own health care decisions. It would make available to individuals and families a modest but still significant tax credit, possibly as much as $2,500 per year per family, on the basis of a tax credit that could be used specifically for the purchasing of health insurance. Health insurance that could be carried from one job to another and purchased and used across state lines. This would increase competition, and this would leave you as an individual, leave Americans and their families in charge of their own health care decisions rather than outsourcing them to Washington, D.C. bureaucrats. There is another similar plan that's been proposed in the House that was drafted by the Republican Study Committee in the House of Representatives. It involves a similar system of tax credits and then also deals with what we do with the so-called residual market in the health insurance industry, how to better provide health insurance for individuals and families with special difficult health conditions that make it difficult for them to insure. We do have proposals out there that have been introduced by Republicans, proposals that really need and deserve consideration, but proposals that have been overlooked because President Obama and the overwhelmingly Democratic Congress in power in 2009 and 2010 chose instead to push aside all ideas like these ones and move ahead with a 2,700-page law that none of them had read. They were told by the Speaker of the House at the time, you've got to pass it to find out what's in it. And as we've learned what's in it, we haven't been enthused. In fact, the law was never popular with the American people. It's never enjoyed approval by a majority of Americans, and it has steadily declined in popularity ever since it was passed 3.5 years ago. Since then, I would add, we've seen the law rewritten not just once but twice by the Supreme Court of the United States, acting unconstitutionally when it found that the law was essentially unconstitutional as written in 2 different respects, and the court rewrote it rather than invalidating it. And then you've had the President of the United States rewrite it 3 or 4 or 5 times, depending on which count you use, rewrite it unconstitutionally without any statutory or constitutional authority. And so we need to get back on the message, back on the topic of discussing what kind of health care reform we really need, rather than sticking with this one 2,700-page law that no one read at the time they passed it and that's been rewritten many times since then.
Let's take another one of our online questions. This is coming from Jeffrey. He asks, what are you doing to bring about cooperation in the House and Senate to end this government shutdown? Okay,
so Jeffrey, what we're doing is every single day I'm working with my colleagues in the House of Representatives and my fellow Republicans here in the Senate to try to move forward legislation as to which there is broad-based bipartisan consensus, meaning legislation to fund non-controversial aspects of the federal government, things like veterans benefits, like the National Park Service, like the operation of the District of Columbia government. We need some of these basic things funded. We've already acted with one of these where we got 100% unanimous consent in the Senate for something that was also passed unanimously in the House. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. That was pay for our active duty military personnel. We got that passed in the Senate. Since then, the House has been passing a number of other incremental spending measures, and each time those have been passed, when they've gotten over to the Senate, Harry Reid refuses to bring them up for a vote. He says, we're not going to vote on these because unless you're going to vote to fund everything in government, we're not going to allow you to vote to fund anything in government. That's no way to run a government, and we're not going to do that here. You know, there is an interesting environment here in Washington. Sometimes what is perceived is an absence of cooperation, an absence of compromise. And occasionally that occurs. Other times you have what I call collusion. You have an unusual and unhealthy willingness to agree on things that are harmful to the American people. And I call that collusion. That's what results in $17 trillion in debt that we add to at a rate of nearly $1 trillion every year. That's collusion. That's the bad kind of compromise, the compromise that results in everyone just capitulating and everyone agreeing that they'll just spend more money and send the bill to the next generation. That's un-American. It doesn't work. It results in a really nasty form of taxation without representation. We fought a war over that, and we won that war. We shouldn't go back to that pernicious practice.
Hi, Senator. My big concern right now, what I think is dysfunctional in Washington, is the 3 branches of government have totally lost track of what their responsibilities are. You guys pass laws, and the laws are enumerated, and they become the law of the land, and the executive branch picks and chooses what lines, what sections that they are going to enforce and not enforce. And so I guess my question is twofold. What's the Congress going to do about it to make sure that they get the power to legislate back? And is there a way to sue the executive branch or force them to comply with the laws that you guys pass?
Okay, great question, Mike. Thank you for bringing this up. You know, there are 2 aspects of the Constitution that I think are the most important aspect of our Constitution. One involves separation of powers, the separation of power between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The other one involving the separation of power between the national government, our federal government, and our state and local governments. We call that federalism. Both of these kinds of separation of powers have been distorted over the years. You refer to a very chronic problem that we have here that involves the excessive delegation of legislative authority by the legislative branch over to the executive branch. We do this by passing really broad laws that are popular, that make it easy for senators and congressmen to get reelected because they sound really nice. Nobody will find them objectionable when we pass a law that says something like, we shall have clean air. I mean, who's going to vote against that? You'd have to be crazy to vote against the law that says, we shall have clean air. And then you read the fine print, and the fine print says, and we, Congress, hereby delegate to the EPA the power to decide what clean air is, what pollution is, what happens to polluters, and to enforce those same laws that will be made within the executive branch agency, here the EPA. Then, when the EPA comes up with laws, it's essentially writing the laws at that point. Congress has made the big L law, the EPA writes the small l law, and then it enforces those. This violates our constitutional oath. This violates the constitutional command that you can't have the same people making the law who are also enforcing the law. You also can't have anyone making the law who's not elected. You know, senators are elected for 6-year terms, congressmen are elected for 2-year terms. And you need to be able to fire your lawmakers when you don't like the laws that they pass. So this kind of excessive delegation of lawmaking authority has for too long been ignored by the courts. The courts are willing to leave it alone. And so what we have to do is fix it within Congress. And what that's going to require is for more people to reach out to their members of Congress and tell them, please don't delegate your lawmaking power. You know, Charles de Montesquieu, who was one of the most influential political philosophers on the founding generation, said that it's really dangerous when you combine the legislative authority with the executive authority, because the same people who would make corrupt or tyrannical laws would also enforce them in a tyrannical manner. And that results in a really nasty form of government that we don't want in this country ever. There's a very simple fix to a lot of this problem, a problem that has resulted from, again, Congress enacting really broad laws and then delegating the real lawmaking authority to the executive branch. Last year, for example, Congress passed about 1,500 pages worth of law. The executive branch, by contrast, issued 77,000 pages of new regulations. That's the length of last year's Federal Register, the cumulative yearly index of regulations as they're announced, as they're proposed, as they're submitted to the public for review. There's a fairly simple fix to this problem. And the fix involves a legislative proposal of which I'm an original co-sponsor in the Senate. It's called the REINS Act, R-E-I-N-S. Think of reining in your horse. The REINS Act says, in essence, that anytime an executive branch agency issues a new federal regulation, if that regulation is a major rule, meaning it will have a significant economic impact on the entire country, it will take effect if and only if Congress first acts on it, and it has to be passed into law by the House, passed by the Senate, and then signed into law by the President, just like any other law. This would allow us to continue to rely on the training and the expertise of the men and women who serve in the executive branch and who might have training and experience that can help us better understand how best to regulate in various aspects of our government. But it would put members of Congress back in charge of actually making the law, so that if they vote to uphold a law, if they vote to pass a law that you don't like, that makes it easier for you to remove them.
Okay, since the IRS is in charge of Obamacare, and since they are under investigation right now, can you use that argument to help, to either fight Obamacare completely, to repeal it, or to delay it for a year?
Yes, Sharon, I think that's a great argument. It's an argument that I've used from time to time to try to help people understand that this law is not something that we should welcome. This law is something that a lot of people justifiably and very understandably are worried about. I mean, look, given the fact that it's going to be enforced to a significant degree by the Internal Revenue Service, this is not your neighborhood-friendly government agency. This is the world's biggest tax collection agent, and it's not a tax collection agent that has the support, the trust, the confidence of the American people, nor should it. This is an agency that has been used again and again and again for several years as a bully pulpit for the president's political opponents. Now, I want to make very clear, this too is not necessarily a distinctively Democratic or a distinctively liberal problem. This kind of thing happens in Republican administrations too. It happens in Republican administrations and with Democratic administrations. It's just the nature of the beast. When you give this much power to government, it will be abused from time to time for partisan political purposes, which is exactly why we should not be entrusting 1/6 of our nation's economy. We should not be entrusting the very personal, the very private, the very intimate details of the lives of the American people, the lives of individuals and families in America, to the Internal Revenue Service. Remember, this is a group that has for years discriminatorily applied standards in order to disfavor organizations that were deemed hostile to the president's partisan political interests. Now, what we've learned through these various scandals over the last few months are things about various scandals that confirm all of our worst fears about government. We've learned that your government is spying on you, that your government is lying to you, that your government is targeting you. And now we're getting ready to expand government again and put the Internal Revenue Service in charge of your health care. This is wrong. We have to stop it. And the only way we can stop it at this point is for Congress to say we will not fund another dime to implement this law, a law that the American people reject, and a law that the president himself refuses to follow.
Yes, Senator, I agree with all that you have been saying, but I'm wondering why we can't get all of that information out to the American people so they now recognize the abuses of the Obama administration.
Gary, thank you for calling in. That is a very helpful point, and it's a difficult question, but I'll tell you, all of us can make a difference, more than at any other time in the history of America, or the history of the world for that matter. You can make a difference. Any individual can make a big difference. Never in the history of the world has it been so easy for so few people with so few resources to distribute a message to so many. Through modern technology and the innovation of things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and political blogs, you and all of your friends and your neighbors, people who see the world like you do, can make a big difference just by talking to the people that you know, speaking out online, and encouraging everyone you know to do the same thing. If you and your family members and your friends distributed these messages across those social media networks that I described, sent emails to everyone you know, we could, in a very short period of time, get the American people very, very informed, because this sort of sets off a chain reaction. And once people come to understand that this is not just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore, this is about the Washington, D.C. political establishment versus the American people. So, you know, it's people like you who took this situation that people once described as impossible. You know, when we first started out with this message that we can and we should and we must and we will defund Obamacare, back in early July when the president said, I'm not going to follow the law's not ready to implement, so I'm going to change it even though I don't have the authority to do so. Because he did that, we said, well, then we're not going to fund the law's implementation. People right up front told us that's impossible. Some of them said you can't even do it. It's not even physically, legally possible to write a law that defunds Obamacare. Well, they were wrong. And before long, they stopped saying it was impossible. Then they just said it was improbable. And little by little, you know, we set up websites where people could go. Some 2 million people showed up at one website and signed a petition saying, yeah, we want you to defund Obamacare. Democrats, Republicans, independents, they all joined in. They went from saying it was impossible to saying it was improbable. In time, it became absolutely unstoppable. Because when the American people speak, Congress listens. Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes members of Congress will delay. You know, it reminds me a little bit of what Winston Churchill once said. He said, the American people can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other available alternative. Congress is much like how Winston Churchill once described Americans. Congress can be counted on to do the right thing, but sometimes only after it's exhausted every other alternative. The American people have spoken, and they've spoken with a loud voice. They need to continue to do so. As they continue to do so, this message will be heard loud and clear, and this law will be stopped.
Hi. My question is, what as citizens do we do to help, push forward change and to get, the shutdown over with so that the government will go in the direction that it needs to?
Call Harry Reid and ask Harry Reid and all Senate Democrats to start agreeing to fund government programs as to which there is broad-based bipartisan consensus. Have Harry Reid start to vote on and pass the bills to fund things like the National Park Service, like the Veterans Administration, like the funding of the District of Columbia, the funding of all these individual bills, these step-by-step bills that the House of Representatives has passed. If we'll pass these bills and other ones that the House of Representatives is still working on, we can quickly get to the point where we're funding 98, 99% of all government functions. That'll focus the debate where we want it to be, where we need it to be, on Obamacare. But there's no reason to hold up funding for veterans simply because we disagree on what to do about health care reform. So help me spread that message. Ask why it is that President Obama is trying to inflict so much pain on the American people. Why it is that the president is unwilling to come to the bargaining table, unwilling to negotiate on anything. I mean, he's actually been saying on national television, I will not negotiate. Meaning, I, the President of the United States, am telling Congress that it must fund everything or I will not allow it to fund anything. He's threatening to veto anything that funds anything short of everything. That's crazy. That's absurd. No one operates a government that way, and we're not going to allow him to do that here.